February 9th, 1945, 10:15 p.m., the Luzon Strait, Philippine Sea. Commander John Kerr Fife stood alone on the bridge of the USS Batfish, staring into absolute darkness. The tropical night pressed against him like a wet blanket, the air so thick with humidity that every breath felt earned. 60 feet below his boots, his submarine cut through the black water at 12 knots, her diesel engines humming their familiar rhythm. Then the radar operator's voice crackled through the intercom, cutting through the night with words that would change everything. "Skipper, we've got interference on the APR. Somebody else's radar, bearing 310. Fife's heart rate didn't change. After 18 months commanding this boat, after surviving depth charges, grounding on an uncharted volcanic peak, and barely escaping a heavily armed Japanese decoy ship, he had learned to keep his pulse steady when the world wanted him dead. But what he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that over the next 76 hours, he and the 65 men aboard the Batfish would accomplish something never done before and never done again in the history of submarine warfare. They were about to sink 3 enemy submarines in 4 days. And the most terrifying part? They would do it in a boat that everyone had written off. Boat so broken, so compromised, that her own captain had written in his log, "Now any speed over 3 knots, and we sound like a freight train." If you're already hooked on this incredible story of courage, ingenuity, and the most remarkable feat in submarine versus submarine combat ever recorded, do me a favor. Hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. The story you're about to hear deserves to be told, and your support helps us bring these forgotten heroes back to life. Now, let me take you back to how Commander Fife and his crew ended up in those dark waters, because to understand the miracle they were about to perform, you first need to understand everything working against them. The USS Batfish was born on a freezing New Hampshire morning. December 31st, 1942, at the Portsmouth Navy Yard, workers laid down her keel as the final hours of that terrible year ticked away. America was still reeling from the disaster at Pearl Harbor. The submarine force had lost boat after boat to enemy action, mechanical failure, and worst of all, their own defective torpedoes that refused to explode. The American submarine service in 1942 was fighting with one hand tied behind its back. The Mark 14 torpedo, the primary weapon of the fleet, was a disaster. It ran 10 feet deeper than its setting. Its magnetic exploder detonated prematurely, or not at all. Its contact exploder was so poorly designed that it often crushed on impact rather than triggering. Submarine captains returned from patrol after patrol with stories of perfect shots that yielded nothing but frustration. By some estimates, the torpedo failures cost the Navy the equivalent of an entire fleet's worth of enemy shipping in the first year of the war alone. Skippers raged against the Bureau of Ordnance. Test results were faked to cover up the problems. Men died because of bureaucratic incompetence and institutional arrogance. But slowly, painfully, the problems were being fixed. New detonators were developed, depth settings were adjusted. By the time Batfish went to war, her torpedoes, while still imperfect, were vastly more reliable than those carried by the first submarines to challenge Japan. But the Batfish was different in other ways too. She was a Balao-class submarine, the newest and most advanced design in the American fleet. 311 feet of steel and firepower, armed with 10 torpedo tubes and a crew of 70 determined souls. Her hull was built from a new high-tensile steel, thicker than her predecessors, allowing her to dive deeper than any previous American submarine, a certified test depth of 400 feet, with a theoretical crush depth approaching 900. The Balao class represented everything the Navy had learned in 2 decades of submarine development. Her 4 diesel engines could push her across the surface at over 20 knots, fast enough to outrun most freighters and keep pace with fleet operations. When she dove, twin electric motors drove her through the depths at nearly 9 knots, drawing power from banks of batteries that weighed more than 50 tons combined. Life aboard a fleet submarine was unlike anything in the surface Navy. The 66 men who crewed a Balao-class boat lived in conditions that would have been considered inhumane ashore. Bunks were stacked 3 high in compartments barely 6 feet tall. Fresh water was rationed so strictly that showers were a rare luxury. The air grew thick with diesel fumes, cooking odors, and the smell of men who couldn't bathe properly for weeks at a time. But there were compensations. Submarine duty paid better than surface duty, hazard pay for the risks they faced. The food was the best in the Navy, a deliberate policy to maintain morale in such confined conditions. And there was a camaraderie, a sense of shared purpose that surface sailors rarely experienced. When a submarine dove, every man aboard knew that his life depended on every other man doing his job perfectly. There was no room for slackers, no tolerance for mistakes. That depth would save her life more than once. She slid into the water on May 5th, 1943, and by late August, she was commissioned and ready for war. Her first commanding officer was Lieutenant Commander Wayne Merrill, a steady hand who took her through shakedown in her first patrols. But Batfish's early career was marked by frustration and near disaster. On her very first war patrol, operating south of Honshu in the bitter January of 1944, Batfish's radar painted the most tempting target imaginable, the Japanese super battleship Yamato, one of the two largest warships ever built. At 72,000 tons, bristling with 18-inch guns capable of firing shells weighing as much as a small car, Yamato was a prize beyond measure. Merrill tried to close. The crew watched with growing excitement as the massive contact moved across their screens. But the seas were murderous that day, towering waves that made torpedo runs nearly impossible. The Yamato's escorts were alert, their depth charges ready, and then the moment passed. The battleship steamed away, her screws audible through Batfish's hull, her wake the only proof she had ever been there. One crewman later recalled, "Her screws shook the whole boat as she passed directly over us. They had touched greatness and let it slip through their fingers." The second patrol was worse. Bad weather pinned them down, and they returned to Pearl Harbor without firing a single torpedo at anything larger than a fishing sampan. The crew was demoralized. The boat seemed cursed. But everything changed in May 1944, when a new captain came aboard at Midway Atoll. His name was John Kerr Fife, though everyone called him Jake. Born in 1914, he had graduated from the Naval Academy in 1936 and had already proven himself as an officer aboard other submarines. At 30 years old, he had the calm demeanor of a man twice his age and the aggressive instincts of someone who understood that in submarine warfare, hesitation meant death. Under Fife's command, Batfish became a different boat entirely. Some captains led through fear. They maintained rigid discipline, kept distance from their crews, ruled their boats like petty dictators. It was one way to run a warship, and some very successful submarines were commanded that way. Jake Fife chose a different path. He was demanding, no question about that. He expected perfection from every man aboard. He drilled his crew relentlessly, running practice attacks until the torpedo crews could load tubes in their sleep, until the diving officer could take the boat down in seconds, until every man knew exactly what to do in any emergency. But he also cared. He learned his men's names, their stories, their families back home. He ate the same food they ate, shared the same cramped quarters, breathed the same recycled air. When the depth charges fell, he was calm, not because he didn't feel fear, but because he knew his crew needed to see confidence. "He was like a father to me," one crewman would later say. It was a sentiment echoed by many who served under Fife's command. On her third patrol, operating off the coast of Honshu, Batfish proved what she could do. Fife pressed attacks that other captains might have avoided. They sank a transport, then a freighter. They engaged a convoy of Japanese warships, weaving between escorts, their torpedoes finding their marks. But it was during this patrol that Batfish came closest to dying. The chart said the water was 400 feet deep. They were wrong. Fife had ordered a crash dive to escape depth charges. The boat plunged downward, the crew at their stations, the needle on the depth gauge spinning clockwise, 200 feet, 240 feet. And then impact. Batfish slammed into an uncharted volcanic peak, her hull groaning in protest. She was stuck, wedged against the rock at 240 feet, while above them, Japanese patrol boats dropped depth charge after depth charge. For 8 hours, they waited. The explosions came in waves. Over 50 depth charges detonated around them, the concussions rattling teeth and shaking loose fittings. The crew moved silently, communicating in whispers and hand signals. The air grew thick and stale as the carbon dioxide scrubbers worked overtime. But Batfish held. The thick Balao-class hull, designed for exactly this kind of punishment, absorbed the blasts. And when the Japanese finally left, convinced they had killed their prey, Fife carefully backed his submarine off the peak and nursed her to the surface. The damage was significant. Her starboard propeller shaft was bent. Her sound head was jammed, reducing her underwater listening capabilities. But she was alive. They continued the patrol. On the fourth and fifth patrols, Batfish's legend grew. She helped sink the Japanese destroyer Samidare, already damaged and grounded on a reef. Fife put 2 more torpedoes into her, breaking her back and ensuring she would never sail again. They engaged convoys, survived more depth charges, and added kill after kill to their tally. But by December 1944, when Batfish returned to Pearl Harbor to prepare for her 6th patrol, she was showing her age. The refit was supposed to last 16 days. 67 separate alterations, repairs, and modifications were planned. They upgraded her deck gun from a 4-inch to a more powerful 5-inch weapon. They added a 40mm anti-aircraft gun. They worked around the clock. But the war didn't wait. When Batfish put to sea on December 30th, 1944, she was far from fighting trim. Both periscopes leaked badly, making accurate observations difficult. And worse, far worse, Her machinery had developed a serious noise problem. Submarines survive on silence. The entire doctrine of underwater warfare depends on remaining undetected, on slipping through the depths like a ghost. But something in Batfish's drivetrain had gone wrong. At anything above 3 knots underwater, her reduction gears screamed loud enough to be heard on passive sonar for miles. Fife wrote in his patrol report, "Now any speed over 3 knots, and we sound like a freight train." It was a death sentence waiting to be executed. Any competent Japanese sonar operator would hear them coming from half an ocean away. And yet, Fife took his broken boat to sea, because the mission waiting for them was too important to delay. What Fife didn't know when he left Pearl Harbor was that American codebreakers had already intercepted Japanese communications that would determine where he would hunt. The year 1945 had opened with the liberation of the Philippines in full swing. American forces had landed at Lingayen Gulf on January 9th, and the Japanese position on Luzon was collapsing. But the Imperial Japanese Navy faced a peculiar problem. Their air force in the Philippines had been annihilated, hundreds of aircraft destroyed, their pilots left stranded on the ground with no planes to fly. These weren't ordinary men. These were highly trained aviators, some with years of combat experience. In a war that was increasingly being decided by air power, every trained pilot was worth his weight in gold. A single fighter pilot took years to train properly. He needed hundreds of hours of flight time before he could be trusted in combat. He needed to learn dogfighting tactics, navigation, instrument flying, carrier operations. He needed experience, the kind of experience that could only be gained by surviving combat missions. Japan had begun the war with some of the finest pilots in the world. Men who had fought in China, who had honed their skills over years of peacetime training, who flew aircraft like the legendary Zero that initially outclassed everything America could put in the air. But those pilots were dying. The inexorable mathematics of war, the attrition, the accidents, the training missions that ended in crashes, were bleeding Japan's pilot corps white. The men stranded in the Philippines represented a resource that couldn't easily be replaced. The Japanese High Command made a decision. They would evacuate these valuable pilots from the Philippines to Formosa, where new aircraft waited. From there, the pilots could rejoin the fight, perhaps as kamikazes, perhaps as defenders of the home islands. The kamikaze program was in full swing by February 1945. Desperate men in obsolete aircraft dove at American ships, exchanging their lives for a chance at taking enemies with them. The program needed pilots, experienced pilots, who could actually hit their targets. Every aviator rescued from the Philippines was another potential divine wind. The first attempt used surface ships. On February 3, 1945, a small convoy including the destroyer Ume departed Takao, Formosa, bound for the northern coast of Luzon. American aircraft found them. By the end of the day, Ume was sinking, hit by 3 direct bomb hits, her 77 crewmen dying with her. The surface route was suicide. The Japanese turned to their submarines. Vice Admiral Shigeyoshi Miwa, commander of the Japanese 6th Fleet, the submarine force, issued orders on February 4th. 4 submarines would carry out the mission, Row 115, Row 46, Row 112, and Row 113. They were to proceed to Takao, offload their deck gun ammunition and reserve torpedoes to make room for passengers, then sail to Batulinao on the northern coast of Luzon. There, they would collect the stranded pilots and ferry them to safety. But American intelligence was listening to everything. The codebreakers at Frumel, Fleet Radio Unit Melbourne, intercepted Miwa's orders almost immediately. They knew the submarines were coming. They knew when they would arrive. They even knew the pickup point. On February 3rd, Batfish received a message that made everything clear. The targets were Japanese submarines engaged in an evacuation operation. Fife positioned his broken, noisy boat in the Luzon Strait and waited. The night of February 9th was moonless and hot, the kind of tropical darkness that swallows everything. Batfish was running on the surface, her diesel engines charging batteries while her radar swept the empty sea. At 10:15 p.m., the APR radar detector picked up emissions. Someone else was using radar, and they were close. In the Pacific War, this was actually unusual. Japanese submarines were equipped with radar, but they rarely used it well. Their Type 22 surface search radar could detect targets at moderate range, but there was a catch. Every time they turned it on, they announced their position to anyone with a receiver tuned to the right frequency. The irony was almost poetic. The Japanese had developed radar technology independently. In some ways, their early sets were quite capable, but they never fully integrated radar into their naval doctrine the way the Americans had. They used it cautiously, sporadically, often at exactly the wrong moments. And they had no idea that the Americans could detect them. The American APR radar detector was a masterpiece of electronic intelligence. Operating passively, receiving signals without transmitting any of its own, it could pick up Japanese radar emissions from remarkable distances. When a Japanese submarine captain swept his radar across the horizon looking for American ships, He was actually sending a beacon straight to any APR-equipped vessel in range. "Here I am," that beacon said. "Come and find me." American submarines carried the APR, a passive detector that could pick up Japanese radar emissions from miles away. The Japanese, scanning for American ships, were actually painting themselves as targets. It was a fatal flaw that American submarine captains learned to exploit with devastating effectiveness. Fife understood this advantage perfectly. He had trained his radar operators to recognize Japanese emissions, to distinguish between the different types of radar the enemy used. When the APR picked up signals, his crew could often tell him not just that a target was out there, but what kind of target it was. Fife ordered battle stations. The next minutes unfolded with agonizing precision. Batfish's own SJ radar soon painted a contact at 11,000 yards, about 6 miles, on a course of 310. The target was heading northwest, away from Luzon, away from the pickup point. That meant one thing. The submarine had already collected its passengers and was heading home to Formosa. The pilots were aboard. The men Japan had risked so much to save were probably sitting in the cramped compartments of that submarine right now, waiting to reach safety, dreaming of the aircraft that awaited them in Formosa. Fife had a decision to make. His boat was compromised, leaking periscopes, screaming reduction gears. A submerged approach at silent speed would take hours and might fail entirely. The Japanese submarine might hear them coming and dive, disappearing into the depths. Submarine captains in World War II faced this kind of decision constantly. The textbook approach would be to submerge, approach slowly and quietly, and attack from periscope depth. It was safer, more methodical, more by the book. But the textbook approach took time, and time was something Fife couldn't afford to waste. Every minute that passed brought the Japanese submarine closer to Formosa, closer to friendly waters, closer to escape. But there was another option. A surface approach. At night, in the darkness, submarines were nearly invisible, and Batfish was faster on the surface than any Japanese submarine underwater. It was aggressive. It was risky. It was exactly what Jake Fife had been doing for the past 18 months. Fife ordered all ahead full. The chase began. Batfish closed the distance steadily, her radar tracking the target as the range dropped. 8,000 yards, 6,000, 4,000. At 11:31 p.m., Fife fired 4 torpedoes from the forward tubes, aiming by radar alone. The fish streaked through the water, running straight and true. All 4 missed. The Japanese submarine had increased speed at the last moment, throwing off Fife's calculations. Batfish heard 4 explosions in the distance, the torpedoes detonating at the end of their runs, their magnetic exploders triggered by nothing but empty water. But incredibly, the Japanese submarine didn't react. She maintained her course and speed as if nothing had happened. Either her captain hadn't heard the explosions, or he assumed they were distant and unrelated. Fife couldn't believe his luck. He ordered another approach. By midnight, now February 10th, Batfish had closed to just over 1,000 yards. Fife was alone on the bridge, his binoculars pressed to his eyes, straining to make out the enemy's silhouette against the black horizon. And there she was. A low, dark shape. The distinctive conning tower of a Japanese submarine, riding low in the water, completely unaware that death was already pointed at her heart. At 12:02 a.m., Fife gave the order to fire. 3 torpedoes left the forward tubes. The first ran hot, jamming in its tube and requiring emergency procedures to disarm, but the second torpedo ran true. The night exploded in a brilliant red flash. The Japanese submarine, almost certainly Row 55, detonated in a fireball that lit up the entire sky. The hull broke apart instantly, debris raining down onto the water. Batfish's sonar operator reported breaking up noises, the unmistakable sound of a submarine dying, her compartments flooding, her hull collapsing as she plunged toward the bottom. Fife ordered his searchlight rigged. For 20 minutes, Batfish swept the area, looking for survivors, looking for debris. There was nothing, no one. One down. The crew barely had time to process what they had accomplished. Submarine versus submarine kills were exceedingly rare, among the hardest shots in naval warfare, but Fife was already planning his next move. Intelligence indicated more Japanese submarines were en route. Row 112 and Row 113 had departed Takao and were heading for the pickup point. Fife repositioned Batfish and waited. But the next day brought danger from an unexpected direction. On the morning of February 10th, Batfish detected approaching aircraft, 4 American fighters escorting a Navy PBY Catalina flying boat. Fife ordered an emergency dive to periscope depth and attempted to establish radio contact with the flight. Then sonar reported a torpedo in the water, heading straight for them. Someone had fired on them. Fife didn't hesitate. "Take her down! Emergency deep!" Batfish plunged, her crew racing to their stations, the depth gauge spinning toward crushed depth. The torpedo passed overhead, close enough that several crewmen swore they could hear its propeller. It had been a friendly fire incident. The American aircraft had mistaken Batfish for a Japanese submarine and attacked. This was the war. This was how quickly everything could end, killed not by the enemy, but by your own side, your own country, your own allies. But Batfish survived again. That night, February 11th, she was back on station. At 7:51 p.m., the radar operator reported a contact at 8,000 yards. Simultaneously, the APR picked up Japanese radar emissions, the same pattern as before. Another submarine. This time, Fife knew exactly what to do. He had refined his approach based on the previous night's experience. He began closing the distance, tracking the target on radar, his crew at battle stations throughout the boat. At 8:37 p.m., Lookout spotted the target visually. A low-lying submarine with no sail, riding barely above the waterline. She was smaller than the first victim, probably a Row 100 class boat. Fife pressed the approach. But at 9:05 p.m., just as Batfish was preparing to fire the Japanese submarine dove, her captain had finally noticed something wrong, a radar return perhaps, or a shadow on the dark horizon. For 30 minutes, the contact disappeared. Then, at 9:35 p.m., she resurfaced. Perhaps her captain thought the danger had passed. Perhaps he needed to charge batteries. Perhaps he simply couldn't stay submerged any longer. Whatever the reason, it was a fatal mistake. Fife had maintained his position, waiting in the darkness like a spider at the center of its web. The moment the Japanese submarine's conning tower broke the surface, Batfish's radar painted her perfectly. At 10:37 p.m., Fife fired 4 torpedoes. 3 found their mark. Row 112 erupted in a catastrophic explosion, her hull splitting open, her 61 crewmen dying in seconds. The blast was so violent that debris rained down for nearly a minute afterward. 2 down. Now the pressure mounted. Intelligence confirmed that at least one more submarine, Row 113, was still approaching the pickup point, but there was a problem. Batfish was running low on torpedoes. She had started the patrol with a full load of 24. Between this patrol and previous attacks, she had expended most of them. After the 2 kills, she had only a handful remaining. Every shot would have to count. The hours of February 12th passed with agonizing slowness. Batfish patrolled her station, radar sweeping, crew resting in shifts. Fife caught what sleep he could in the tiny captain's cabin, his body attuned to every change in the engine's rhythm. Then, at 2:15 a.m. on February 13th, the radar operator called out, "A contact! Bearing 220, range 10,700 yards." Fife was on the bridge within seconds. This contact was behaving differently. She was moving on a southeasterly course, coming from Formosa, heading toward Luzon, toward the pickup point. She hadn't collected her passengers yet. Fife had a choice. He could attack now and risk alerting other submarines in the area, or he could wait, track this boat and strike when she was most vulnerable, loaded with passengers who would slow her dive time and reduce her maneuverability. He chose aggression. At 2:41 a.m., the Japanese submarine dove. She had detected something, perhaps Batfish's radar emissions, perhaps the silhouette of her conning tower against the stars. Whatever the cause, she was running. This was the most dangerous moment of the hunt. When both submarines were submerged, the game changed entirely. Sound became everything. The whine of propellers, the hum of electric motors, the ping of active sonar probing the depths. And Batfish had that terrible noise problem. Every turn of her screws above 3 knots sent a symphony of mechanical sounds echoing through the water. The Japanese submarine's sonar operator might hear her coming from miles away. Fife submerged his own boat. For the next hour, both submarines played a deadly game of blindman's bluff, hunting each other by sound alone in the black depths. Batfish's noisy reduction gears were a constant liability. Any moment, the Japanese might hear her and launch a counterattack. The crew barely breathed. Men moved through the compartments in stocking feet, communicating in whispers and hand signals. The air handlers were shut down to reduce noise. The temperature climbed as body heat accumulated in the sealed spaces. This was what submariners called silent running, a protocol that had been developed in World War I and refined through decades of practice. Every non-essential system was secured. Every unnecessary movement was forbidden. The boat became a steel coffin, drifting through the depths, listening for the enemy. But Batfish had one advantage: patience. Fife knew that the Japanese submarine couldn't stay down forever. Her batteries would drain. Her air would grow foul. Eventually, she would have to surface, would have to run her diesels, would have to breathe. All Batfish had to do was wait. At 3:10 a.m., the Japanese submarine surfaced again. Her batteries were depleted. She had no choice. In the age before nuclear power, submarines were creatures of the surface, forced to breathe air and run their diesels or slowly suffocate in the depths. Fife was ready. At 3:53 a.m., Batfish regained radar contact at 9,800 yards. Fife closed carefully, aware that this was his last chance. If he missed, there were no more torpedoes to spare. At 4:48 a.m., with the range down to 1,500 yards, Fife fired 3 torpedoes from the stern tubes. The wait felt eternal. 3 torpedoes running at 45 knots cover 1,500 yards in about a minute and a half. 90 seconds of silence, 90 seconds of holding breath, 90 seconds of wondering if the calculations were correct. Then the first torpedo hit. Row 113 broke apart with a thunderous explosion, her bow lifting clear of the water before sliding beneath the waves. 59 men died in seconds. The entire crew, plus however many evacuated pilots she might have been carrying. 3 submarines, 76 hours, a feat unmatched in the history of naval warfare. When Batfish finally returned to Pearl Harbor, the reception was triumphant. The crew had accomplished something that the entire submarine force could scarcely believe. In an era when submarine versus submarine kills were counted on one hand for the entire war, Fife and his men had claimed 3 in less than 4 days. The Presidential Unit citation followed, the highest honor that could be given to a naval unit. Commander Fife received the Navy Cross, the second highest decoration for valor the Navy could bestow. His crew received Silver Stars, Bronze Stars, commendations that recognized their incredible achievement. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the Batfish's triumph was the circumstances under which it was achieved. They had done it in a broken boat, a submarine whose periscopes leaked so badly that accurate observations were nearly impossible, a submarine whose machinery screamed loud enough to be heard for miles, a submarine that by all rights should have been in dry dock, not on patrol. They had done it against impossible odds, against trained enemy crews, in waters where American aircraft were as likely to attack them as the Japanese were. And they had done it because of one man's stubborn refusal to accept that his boat was beaten. Jake Fife would survive the war. He rose through the ranks, eventually reaching the rank of Rear Admiral before his retirement. He passed away in 1994, buried at Arlington National Cemetery with full military honors. The Batfish herself survived as well, one of the lucky few. After the war, she was decommissioned and spent decades in reserve, used occasionally for training. In 1972, she was transferred to the state of Oklahoma and began a remarkable journey that took her up the Arkansas River, yes, a submarine sailing through Oklahoma, to her final resting place in Muskogee. Today, the USS Batfish sits in a park overlooking the Arkansas River, far from any ocean, far from any enemy. She's a museum now, open to visitors who can walk her cramped passageways and imagine what it must have been like to serve aboard her. But there's something those visitors might not realize as they duck through her hatches and peer into her torpedo tubes. They're standing inside a legend, a boat that defied the odds, that broke the rules, that accomplished the impossible. They're standing inside the submarine that proved that courage and skill can overcome any disadvantage. Because in the end, it wasn't about the technology, it wasn't about the torpedoes or the radar or the hull thickness. It was about the men. The 66 sailors who manned their stations in the darkness, who kept their nerve when depth charges fell around them, who trusted their captain to bring them home. It was about Jake Fife, standing alone on the bridge, staring into the night, waiting for the moment to strike. And it was about the Batfish herself, that broken, noisy, leaking submarine that refused to die. 3 submarines, 4 days, 1 boat. The numbers don't do it justice. The story never will. Some achievements exist beyond words, beyond statistics, beyond the neat summaries of history books. They exist in the space between heartbeats, in the darkness before dawn, in the moment when a captain gives the order to fire and everything depends on the next 90 seconds. The USS Batfish lived in that space for 76 hours in February 1945, and she earned her place among the immortals. But the story didn't end there, not really, because buried within this triumph were details that make the achievement even more extraordinary. Consider the Japanese strategy. Vice Admiral Miwa had ordered 4 submarines to participate in the evacuation: Row 115, Row 46, Row 112, and Row 113. Only one of them completed the mission. Our Row 46, delayed by various circumstances, finally reached Batulinao on the night of February 10th, while Batfish was busy sinking her sisters. She picked up 46 evacuated pilots and carried them safely to Takao, arriving on February 12th. Those pilots would survive to fight another day. Row 115 never acknowledged Miwa's orders. She never returned to Takao. Her fate remains uncertain. She may have been sunk by the destroyer escort USS Ulvert M. Moore on January 31st, before the evacuation even began. and the other two, Row 112 and Row 113, met their ends in the Luzon Strait, victims of a submarine that shouldn't have been able to catch them. Consider, too, the technology that made the kills possible. The APR radar detector was a relatively new piece of equipment in 1945. American engineers had developed it specifically to detect Japanese radar emissions, turning the enemy's own technology against them. Every time a Japanese submarine captain turned on his radar to search for threats, he was actually advertising his position to anyone with an APR set. The Japanese didn't know this. Their radar discipline was poor throughout the war, a fatal flaw that American submarines exploited again and again. Fife and his crew used the APR masterfully, detecting their targets long before visual contact was possible. But the APR alone couldn't sink submarines. That required torpedoes, and the Mark 14 torpedo was one of the most problematic weapons in American history. Early in the war, the Mark 14 was notorious for running too deep, failing to explode on contact, and sometimes circling back to attack the submarine that had fired it. By 1945, most of these problems had been fixed, but the weapon still required careful handling and precise calculation. Fife's torpedo attacks were models of efficiency. Against 3 targets, he expended only 11 torpedoes and scored 7 hits, an extraordinary accuracy rate for any era of submarine warfare. His first attack on the night of February 9th missed entirely, but he adapted, adjusted, and never missed again. Consider the human cost. In sinking 3 Japanese submarines, Batfish killed approximately 175 enemy sailors. The Row 100 class boats carried crews of about 60 men each, and some of the submarines may have already embarked evacuated pilots. These were not faceless enemies. They were young men, most of them in their 20s, serving their country in one of the most dangerous roles any military can offer. They died quickly, in explosions that gave them no chance to escape, in waters that claimed their bodies forever. War is cruel. It makes killers of ordinary men and demands that we celebrate their efficiency. The crew of the Batfish did their duty. They saved American lives by preventing Japanese pilots from returning to combat. They shortened the war by demonstrating American naval supremacy. But they also ended 175 stories that would never be told, 175 families that would never see their sons again, 175 graves that exist only in the currents of the Philippine Sea. This is not to diminish the Batfish's achievement. It is simply to remember that every victory has a cost, paid by someone. Consider what might have been. Had the first torpedo attack on February 9th succeeded, the Japanese might have realized that an American submarine was operating in the area. They might have warned Row 112 and Row 113. They might have canceled the evacuation entirely. Had the friendly fire incident on February 10th been slightly different, had the American aircraft's torpedo run a few degrees closer, Batfish would have joined her victims on the bottom. Had Fife been less patient, less skilled, less willing to wait for the perfect shot, he might have expended all his torpedoes before the final kill. The margin between triumph and disaster is often measured in inches, in seconds, in the smallest variations of luck and skill. Batfish found herself on the right side of that margin 3 times in 4 days. That is not coincidence, that is excellence. Consider the legacy. The USS Batfish's feat remains unique in American naval history. No other submarine has ever sunk 3 enemy submarines in a single patrol. The British submarine HMS Upholder accomplished a similar feat in the Mediterranean, sinking 3 Axis submarines over the course of her career, but not in such a compressed time frame. In the entire Pacific War, American submarines sank approximately 25 Japanese submarines. Batfish accounted for 3 of them, 12% of the total, in less than 4 days. The Presidential Unit Citation awarded to Batfish specifically recognized the outstanding performance of duty during her 6th War Patrol. The citation noted that Commander Fife had expertly sought out and sank 3 large enemy submarines in a period of 4 days, using language that would be quoted in naval history books for generations. But perhaps the most fitting tribute came from the men who served aboard her. After the war, the crew of the Batfish formed a reunion association. They gathered annually for decades, growing older together, remembering the young men they had been and the things they had done. They told stories that their families could barely believe, stories of depth charges and torpedoes, of darkness and death, of a noisy boat that somehow became the most lethal submarine killer in the fleet. When Jake Fife attended these reunions, his former crew didn't treat him like a distant commander. They treated him like family, like the man who had brought them home. "He was like a father to me," one crewman later recalled. That, in the end, may be the greatest legacy of all. The Batfish was steel and diesel, electronics and explosives, but she was also men who trusted each other with their lives, who performed impossible feats because failure was unthinkable, who came home when so many others did not. Today, if you visit Muskogee, Oklahoma, you can walk aboard the Batfish, You can stand on the bridge where Fife stood, peer through the periscope that once leaked, touch the torpedo tubes that launched death into the night. The plaques and displays will tell you what happened. They'll give you dates and numbers and coordinates. But they can't give you the darkness. They can't give you the fear. They can't give you the 90 seconds between firing and impact, when everything hangs suspended in possibility. They can't give you the relief when the explosion comes, the confirmation that you'll live another day, that the enemy is sinking and you are not. They can't give you what it felt like to be there. But maybe, if you're quiet enough, if you let the modern world fall away, you can imagine it. You can imagine the humid night air on the bridge, the throb of the diesel engines below, the soft glow of the radar screen painting targets in the darkness. You can imagine the captain's voice, calm and precise, giving the order. Fire! You can imagine the hiss of compressed air, the shudder of the boat, the torpedoes racing away into the black water. You can imagine the waiting, and then the explosion. 3 submarines, 4 days, 1 boat. The USS Batfish. She was a submarine like no other. She did what no submarine had done before or has done since. She took her broken, noisy, compromised self into enemy waters and came back with a record that stands alone in the annals of naval warfare. Her crew is gone now. The last of them passed years ago, taking their first-hand memories with them. Jake Fife rests in Arlington, among the heroes of every American war. But the Batfish remains. She waits in Oklahoma, far from the sea, a monument to what ordinary men can accomplish when everything is on the line. She waits to remind us. She waits to bear witness. She waits to tell her story to anyone willing to listen. And now you know it. 3 submarines, 4 days, 1 boat. The story of the USS Batfish. The submarine that refused to be beaten. The crew that refused to fail. The captain who refused to give up. In the darkness of the Luzon Strait, in the final winter of the Pacific War, they proved something that transcends time and technology. They proved that courage matters. They proved that skill matters. They proved that the human spirit, properly directed, can overcome any obstacle. They proved that even a broken boat, commanded by determined men, can accomplish the impossible. And they proved that some achievements are simply beyond measure. 3 submarines, 4 days, 1 boat, forever.